Usually our speakers start off with a little biography about themselves. I'm going to skip most of that because most of that doesn't have anything to do with either apples or insects. So I'm going to go directly to the point where I became involved with apples. And that goes back to about 1978 or 1979 when I planted my first apple trees. And I brought those trees to fruition and enjoyed their fruit for a good 15 years. And I never had any problem at all with apple maggots. And my neighbor, who had a number of mature apple trees in his yard from an old orchard, he never had a problem with apple maggots either. But then we were down in Pierce County. So one thing, the first lesson you want to know is apple maggots are regional. So when I moved up here to Snohomish County, I began planting apple trees again, and that was around 1995, 96. And for a good 15 years, I never had any problem with apple maggots either. Now, I was starting with some land that had been forest land, and there weren't a lot of other people around me, and there weren't any farms or homesteads. So I think it just took a while for the apple maggots to find me, and they did. One late fall or late summer, I went out to my backyard and I had a dwarf Akani apple tree growing back there. And Akani apple's beautiful, bright crimson, glossy skin. So it was a beautiful sunny day, and I was back there and I picked one of the apples and took a big bite out of it, and yuck, it was full of apple maggots. So that was my first introduction to apple maggots in my yard. Well, as soon as I saw those apple maggots in the one apple, I tried another one. It also was infested, and another one, and it was too. So I decided, well, I know how to solve this problem. So I cut down the Akani apple tree, and I didn't have any problem with that anymore. And I didn't have any problem with the other apple trees for several years. And then I went back one fall, and I was checking out my Chehalis apples. And I bit into one of them, and it was full of apple maggots. And the next one was, and the next one was, and the next one was. I lost the entire crop of that tree, which is a good 60 pounds of apples. Well, that made me mad because I liked the Chehalis apples, and I wasn't going to cut that tree down. So I decided that I was going to do a little bit of research to find out where those problems were coming from and how I could solve them. So I did some reading and went online and did a lot of experimentation. And I came up with a system that works for me so that I can produce blemish-free apples consistently and reliably. So I'm going to share that information with you tonight. So we're going to go to a PowerPoint presentation, and so you will see the slides as I bring them up, and then you will hear my voice over them. So I'm going to share the screen here and hope that I do this right. Let me see if I can do this here. Okay, that
got down at the bottom. Oh, Jim, I'm sorry. It's my fault.
Screen. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I forgot to add you on there.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready.
I always forget that.
That's no problem.
All right, there you go. Try it again.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Does everyone see that okay? Just take a moment here for it to open up right, I think. There we go. Everyone see that okay?
Sorry, Jim, you muted yourself on accident. Sorry about that.
Okay, is that better?
There you go. Yep, just be careful that you don't hit the mute button when you do it. Try it again.
Okay, now we're ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, I've titled my presentation Reducing Apple Maggot Damage in Home Orchards. This is not meant for commercial producers at all. And I use the word reducing because apple maggots are so prevalent and virulent that you're never going to get rid of them completely. So I'm going to tell you how I'm finding success in my treatment of my apples here.
Just the forward or back button.
Yeah, that's not working either. Why isn't that working? Let me go back here and check something else. Oh. Well, we'll do it that way. One way doesn't work, we'll try another way. Okay. The system that I've come up with is relatively easy to use and it doesn't rely on any kind of sprays or poisons. And it relies on two equally important practices. And the first is intervention at key points that will disrupt the insect's life cycle. And the second key point is to use scrupulous orchard hygiene, keep things clean in the orchard so that you don't continue to reinfect the orchard with the apple maggots. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of the apple maggot. Here in the center, you see the year, the spring, summer, fall, and winter. And I'm going to associate the cycle of the insect's life to each of these seasons. So I'm going to jump right here to late spring. And at this time of the year, the adult fly, which you see down here in the lower left, begins to hatch out of the ground. The fly then mates and looks around for apple trees. I don't know how they find the apple trees, and they use other fruits as well, but they prefer the apples. And the female wants to lay eggs under the apple. That egg will then hatch and become the maggots or the larvae inside the apple. So the larvae begin to eat the apple from the inside, leaving the characteristic brown trails. Then, as the year goes on, the mature maggots will leave the apple when the apple falls to the ground. At that point, the maggots crawl out, they enter the soil, and they transfer themselves to the pupa stage. So it's the 4 stages of the insect life that you probably remember from high school biology: adult, egg, larva, and pupa. And it just continues through every year the same way. So what we're going to look for is different ways that we can disrupt that cycle and eliminate the flies. So first thing we want to do is we want to learn something about the adult fly. Now the Latin name is Regulatus pulmonella. And this is the picture of the fly here. This is a little bit larger than actual size. The fly is actually less than 1/4 inch long. They're very tiny little things. And their characteristics are black and white, and right at the center, in the back of the thorax, is a white spot. So that's identifying the fly. So let's take a look at some of the other things we want to know about this critter. The female fly has an organ called an ovipositor. It's like a hypodermic needle. And the female fly will locate an apple and will penetrate the skin of the apple with the ovipositor and begin to lay eggs. And one female fly can lay up to 200 eggs into the immature apples. As the apple grows a little bit, every spot where the egg was laid will often show up as either a dark spot, a dimple in the skin, or misshapen fruit. They can all cause different effects to the apple. But once you see those on your apple tree, you know that you've got a problem and you need to take care of that. Moving on to the next stage is the eggs that have been laid in the apple will hatch, and they turn into the larva or the apple maggot. They hatch within a couple days, and they're tiny little things at that point. They begin chewing the fruit, and they burrow deeper and deeper into the fruit, and they remain in the fruit until the apple falls to the ground. And then, of course, the larvae crawl out, get in the soil, and transfer to the pupa stage. Now the pupa will enter the soil, they'll overwinter there underneath the host tree and continue next spring as the adult flies. Now, again, this is an enlargement of the pupa. They look about the size and appearance of a grain of brown rice. You won't see them. They're just about invisible once they're in the soil. But they're down there, and they will be there for as long as 2 years. But by understanding the cycle of the fly, we can understand where we need to attack it. So we'll go into the next step here and talk about how we're going to interrupt this insect's life cycle. Now, the bad news is even if you're successful at reducing the apple maggot damage in your trees in one season, the next year the flies are going to migrate to your area from other sources. So you have to continue the protections that I'm going to tell you about here every year. They're simple enough that you can do that. You get into a routine and it becomes the second nature as you treat your apples. Now, one of the habits of the adult fly is after they hatch, they go flying around and they look for their friends and they want to mate. But they don't necessarily hang out in your apple trees because what they're looking for is something to eat. And what the adult flies eat is the honeydew that is secreted by aphids and other insects. They also get moisture from your leaves. Now, at that point, a spray could kill the adult fly, but this is a really indefinite method of control because it's not assured that these highly immobile flies are going to contact the spray. Remember that when you spray an insecticide or a poison on a plant, we're relying on the insect at some stage of its life cycle to consume that poison. They have to chew or eat the leaves or the fruit. If they don't do that, either by eating it or by ingesting the poison by grooming themselves or others, the poison is not going to do anything to the insect at all. The problem with the apple maggot fly is because they don't spend that much time in your apple tree, and they're somewhere else, and they're going to come in to lay their eggs on the apples, and then they're going to leave. Their life cycle's over. They don't care anymore. So spraying is not a good control for apple maggots. Now, these apple maggot flies are attracted to different kinds of fruit trees. In Washington, it's primarily apple, but it can also be crabapple. It can also be hawthorn. And I've also seen them in my Asian pear 1 year. It's primarily the apple. That's what we're going to be concentrating on today. Now, in the stores, you will find that you can buy apple maggot lures. And what they consist of is a little plastic vial that contains a liquid. And the plastic is permeable, and the liquid will seep out through the walls of the vial and release a chemical scent that will attract both the male and the female flies to the target trees where you can trap them. Now, I used these lures for 1 or 2 years, and then I stopped to think for a minute. My objective is not to have flies into the apple trees, so why do I want to put a lure out to bring more flies in? So I stopped using them. But I wanted to present this to you, and so you'll know that they are available, and you can get them in the stores. They cost about $10, and you can get 3 lures. But I personally don't think they're necessary, so I don't use them. But I wanted to let you know that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to attack the adult fly using traps. And let me go back here one step. Okay, we're going to attack the fly to try to trap and kill the adults. Now we do this, it's made a lot easier because these flies have a preference, a strong preference for the colors red and yellow. So if we place brightly colored red and yellow traps with a persistent sticky coating on them in your apple trees, you will capture a surprising number of flies before they can lay eggs in your apples. This is our first line of defense, and this is a very, very effective one. Now, the most commonly used traps are either red spheres or bright yellow cards. Now, a while back, I went to a garage sale and I happened to see in their piles of things an antique, and I'll show you this. Right here is a large rubber ball with a hook on it, this probably dates back to the 60s or the 70s, and this is one of the early methods of setting a trap for apple maggot. Now, you can buy something that is very similar. I saw them down at the McClendon's Hardware Nursery down in Woodinville just the other day. They do have these apple traps available. For $10, you can get 3 of them. However, $10 for 3 traps, I think, is pretty expensive because we can do that a lot cheaper. So when I first got into my experimentation, I used ping pong balls I painted red, and they look something like this. Now, I was able to get my apple trap cost down to about 36 cents each. So that was pretty good. And I used those for a year or two. And then I started thinking, well, they like yellow as well. So I went to the next step and I got some yellow signboard, plastic signboard. And this I was able to reduce down to less than 4 cents for a trap. So I've got this down to something that's not only effective, but also very cheap. So that was the experimentation that I've done over the last few years, and it's worked out very well. Now, this is the secret right here. This are the 2 traps I've experimented with. For those of you who have signed up to get our free apple maggot trap kit, you will get, let me stop sharing here and go to the full screen. What you'll get when you get the kits is you'll get 6 of the yellow squares, you'll get 6 wires, and you'll get a can of the Tangle Trap catcher. And this is the real secret because this is what actually will catch and trap the flies. So let me go back to my presentation here. Now, I want to, at this point, go over a couple of little tips. Let me go back here. When you get your apple maggot traps, you'll have to attach the wire. Just put the wire through, turn it a couple times to secure it, and put a loop on the end of the wire. That's what you're going to hang them in the trees with. And then you open up the can, and you'll see there's a brush in the can, very handy. So what I suggest you do is the following. Don't do this in your house. Take the traps to the trees and prepare your traps while you're at the trees. Now, when you're putting the sticky goop onto the traps, I suggest you hold them up here by the wire and you begin to apply the sticky down here at the bottom. Apply it to both sides and work your way up, and also put it on the edges. So work your way up, and when you get to the point where you're almost out of card to hold, you can hold it by the wire and dab the last little bit of card with the tangle trap. The reason you do this is to keep it off your fingers. This is a very sticky, waterproof, persistent adhesive. And you will find that it makes your fingers very gummy. Water does not wash it off. However, the key point I want to get across to you here is to clean your hands off, use cooking oil, vegetable oil, or olive oil. So when you go out to hang your traps, along with the traps and your can of Tangled Trap, I suggest you take a paper towel that has been moistened with some cooking oil. So you'll have that handy. After you've put all your traps in the trees and you've got your sticky on your fingers, you can use the paper towel to get that off, and then that will wash off with soap and water. So keep that in mind, that you will want to remove any of the tangle trap you get on your hands using vegetable oil. You can also use mineral spirits or paint thinner, but that's a little bit more of a harsh chemical, and I recommend just using a vegetable oil. It's very effective. Now, for those of you who want to get more of the Tangle Trap, you can find this at the well-stocked hardware stores. I saw it at McClendon's in Woodinville and at McDaniel's in Snohomish. But you'll get a full can with your free kit, and that will last you, if you just put the 6 traps out, that'll be enough for this year and probably next. Go back here. Okay. Now what you want to do is put 1 or 2 sticky traps in your young trees. Those are about 18 feet tall. and then more traps in more mature trees. So I usually put 5 or 6 traps in my mature apple trees and 3 or 4 in the younger trees. You can apply more sticky goo to the traps if you need to through the season, but I think you'll find that the persistence of this goo is very great. This past February, March, when I was out in my apple trees doing the pruning, I took down the traps from last year and they were still sticky. You'll also want to replace traps that become so thoroughly covered with flies that there's no space left. You want to have some open yellow space on the card for the flies to come in to land on them. And you'll find that the traps are amazingly effective and they can be completely covered. You might actually want to replace them during the year. They are so effective. Last year when I was putting the traps out, I was out in the orchard and I prepared 3 or 4 traps. And I was going to hang them in my tree, and I had them hanging off of my fingers on one hand. So I went around the trees, I was hanging them into the trees. I got down to the last trap, and I went to hang it in the tree, and there was already a fly stuck to that trap. So they really like the yellow color, and they really will stick. So they're very effective in that regard. Because the cost of using yellow cardstock is so cheap, you can throw them away and start spraying with new traps every year. That ball trap that I showed you, the antique there, those were meant to be used year after year, and you'd have to either clean that off, or I've seen people put saran wrap over the ball. They will put their tangle trap over the saran wrap. That way they could use that every year. But with the yellow cardstock, just replace them every year. Now, the second step we're going to go to in preventing the adult fly from continuing a life cycle is to prevent the fly from laying eggs. Now, most of you already know about this, but when you cover your baby apples with little nylon socks or footies, it will prevent the apple maggot fly from laying eggs in the apple. So this is the single most effective measure that will allow you to harvest unblemished fruit. So I highly recommend that you use the combination of the traps and the socks. Now, it might seem to be a tedious chore to put the socks on over the little apples, but you should be in your orchard anyway at this time of the year, because you want to thin the apples, the one largest single apple per cluster. It's very easy to do. Just go through and you can nip them off or use a pair of small pruning shears. But you want to get down to that one large fruit and leave that in the cluster. While you're there, it's a very simple process to just slide the nylon sock over that apple and give it a little twist. Now, when you slide the sock over the apple, you want the apple down in the toe of the sock. You'll have a lot of excess fabric left over. Just give that a simple little twist around the stem of the apple and you're done. I carry or wear a simple apron that has large pockets in the front. I just keep the little footies in the pocket as I go and just keep them handy there. Now, you don't have to cover every apple in your tree. You only want to cover as many as you want perfect fruit. That way, at the end of the year when the apples ripen, you pick all the apples, you keep the ones that have been covered with the socks because they're perfect, and you can destroy all the other fruit that may be infected. If you don't have really bad infestation, you can use those apples for cider. It's not going to bother the taste of the cider or anything. If they're really, really badly infested with the apple maggots, just throw them away. But when you throw them away, we want to give you another caution on that. I'll cover that a little bit later here. But anyway, using the footies to prevent the female fly from laying apples in the apple, then you pull the excess material around the stem. The apple will grow and will stretch the footie around itself. Now you can get these footies at nurseries. You can get them online. Generally, it's a box of 144. They generally cost around $12 for 144. And they also have one other advantage, is that they discourage the codling moth from laying eggs and apples as well. Now, the codling moth is an entirely different insect. I'm not going to cover that in any depth here in this presentation tonight. But the codling moth also lays eggs on the apple tree, but not in the apple. The codling moth lays its eggs around the bark. The eggs then hatch, the larva crawls out of the bark and goes behind the apple, and the larva will then chew its way into the apple. So the codling moth characteristic gamete has a large brown hole on the side of the apple. Generally, the hole is about a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch in diameter, and that's a characteristic codling moth gamete. But in this presentation, I'm just covering the apple maggot. Okay, now here we see the different methods that we've covered here for effectively thwarting the flies from damaging your fruit. So what we have here is, there's your apple maggot lure hanging in the tree there. And I hang it just above the fruit, or above the trap, so that if it does work and it pulls in flies, they're going to find the trap first. And this is one of the ping pong ball traps that I use, and you can see it is covered with flies. So they work very well. And here, of course, you also see the little footies on the apples. This one is applied very well. You can see the apple is completely covered, and you can see the excess of fabric has been twisted around the stem. These two have not been as well covered. You can see the bare apple skin showing through there. So it's possible the apple maggot fly could get through and lay her eggs on the skin of this apple or the skin of that apple there, and the footy would not have given the protection that you want. Now you want to put those footies out when the fruit is about the size of a nickel. That's about the time that the flies come out and begin to lay their eggs, which is around early June. Now what you might want to do is to put your traps out earlier and put them out as soon as you have them made here. When you get them next week, put them in your trees in case the insects come out earlier. And they will also give you a heads up on when the apple maggot flies begin to come into your trees. You'll find out when you hang the traps up there early, nothing will appear on the traps, and all of a sudden you'll start to see the black flies landing on them, and you'll know that your infestation has begun. And generally that's right around the first part of June. Okay, the next thing we're going to do to thwart the apple maggot fly's life cycle is to attack the apple maggot larva. Now, we already know that they stay in the fruit until the apple falls to the ground. Sometimes that will be prematurely, because as the larvae chew their way through the apples, it will damage the fruit will start to rot, and it will fall from the tree early. The larvae are only about 1/4 of an inch long, and when the apple hits the ground, they'll chew their way out of the fruit, and they'll wiggle into the soil and then transform themselves into the pupa. You have to pick up all the fallen fruit promptly when it hits the ground to interrupt the larva life cycle and reduce the number of adult flies the following year. I keep the grass under my trees short so that I can see the apples as they fall. And then every couple of days I'm out there anyway, and I'll just take a plastic grocery bag with me, and I'll just pick up all of the fallen fruit as it occurs through the summer into the fall. Now, what you want to do is when you pick up the fruit, you want to get everything that's on the ground. And when you pick the fruit from the tree in the fall, you want to take all of the fruit off the tree. Even if you aren't going to use it, you're going to take it all off. If you let the fruit fall to the ground, and if it has apple maggots in it, they will simply be planting the seeds for next year's infestation. So if you keep all those apples picked up as a regular process through the year, you will greatly reduce the quantity of apple maggots in your orchard next year. Now, when you dispose of this rejected fruit, there are a couple things I want to tell you about that. I put them in plastic bags and I put them in the garbage. If you put the fruit in a plastic bag, it can't find its way out. Tie the top of the bag shut, and they are trapped in that bag. I put them in the garbage. I know it's going to a landfill. I know that, no, that's not the most ecologically sensitive way of doing things, but they're out of my yard anyway. Don't compost your rejected fruit, because your compost pile is not going to reach the high enough temperature to kill the larva. All you're going to do is give it a comfortable place to spend the winter. You could freeze the apples, and that would kill the larva because they're still soft. But that's going to a lot of trouble. I don't bother doing that. I just put them in the garbage. Once the larva has transformed into the pupa stage, it's a completely different organism, and cold weather doesn't affect it. So even though the winters here get well below freezing for some period of time, the larva, or the pupa, which is now in the soil, is not killed off. But the larva, which is a soft worm-like part of the life cycle of the larva, will freeze, and you can kill it that way. So to summarize the countermeasures that we're going to use here is we're going to trap and kill as many of the adult flies as we can using the red or yellow sticky traps. We're going to prevent the female flies from laying eggs in the apples by placing the little nylon footies over the young apples. We're going to try to capture the insect larvae by removing all the fallen fruit from the ground and by picking all of the apples at the end of the season. We're going to dispose of the larvae of the rejected fruit by placing the apples in a plastic bag and putting it in the garbage. And one additional countermeasure down here at the bottom is we can remove unwanted host trees such as hawthorns or poor quality or wild apples that are nearby. You may have wild apples on your property that you don't collect the fruit from, but they can be a source of apple maggots every year if you don't either treat those apples or get rid of the tree. So that's something to think about. One other deterrent that you can use to control apple maggots is to net the trees. We had a speaker here at the club a year ago, and she did a very good job of explaining how nets can prevent the infestation of different insects in the trees. So I wanted to show this slide here. Now, you have to be very careful in timing when you put the net over the trees. It goes without saying that if you put the net over the trees before the blossoms are pollinated, you won't have any apples at all. You won't have any apple maggots either, but that's not the object here. So using the netting over the trees requires some timing so that the apples are well pollinated, but before the adult apple maggot flies come onto the scene. The mesh of the netting is also important. You want to have a mesh that's about 1 millimeter because the apple maggot flies are only 2 to 4 millimeters. So you want something that's smaller than the flies. I chose this slide also because it illustrates an important point. If you'll see here that the fabric on the netting is simply draped on the ground. Now, if your apple maggot flies were emerging from the ground and you have exposed soil here, the flies are just going to fly right up and get in the trees, and they can infect your apples. So if you're going to net your trees, you need to draw the fabric around the trunk and secure it in some way so that the insects have no way inside the net. Now, the other thing that I don't like apple or the nets for in controlling apple maggots on my trees is they're expensive. A single net, once you buy the net, plus your sales tax, plus your shipping, will cost you about $100 per net. And that's only for a small tree. For a very large mature tree, you'd spend more for the nets. So I don't use the nets. I use the simpler treatment of the traps and the little footies. Now, there's another deterrent that some people use, and this is more like a commercial orchard might use, is a product called Surround. And what it is kaolin clay. Kaolin is a naturally occurring clay. It's a very fine-grained type of clay. And for thousands of years, it's been a source of material for making ceramics and porcelain. But they found out that you can take this very fine-grained clay, you can mix it with water, you can spray it on plants, and it will deter some insects. what it does is it coats the fruit with a dry white film, and it irritates or it confuses the fly. So they tend not to lay their eggs on that fruit. However, you do have to mix up the spray. I've been told that if it's not kept in suspension while you're spraying, it can clog up your sprayer. So it's just one more thing that I would have to do that I would prefer not to do using the other methods that I've found will eliminate the flies. But I wanted to bring this out because for a large scale apple operation, this is another possibility. Another thing to look at is some apple varieties seem to be more prone to getting apple maggot infestations. And from what I've read and what I've seen, the early ripening, thin-skinned, especially sweet apples, tend to be more prone to apple maggot attack. Now, on the web and from my own experience, I know that yellow transparent, Chehalis, Cortland, Akani, and Wealthy are varieties that have been cited as being attractive to the apple maggot fly. Now, I've already mentioned that the Akani apple I had in my yard, I eliminated. I just realized here in the last day or so when I was reviewing my slides, when the apple maggots were in my Akani apples, they were not in the Chehalis apples, which was right next to the Akanis. I cut down the Akani apple tree, right? Okay, a couple of years later, I had apple maggots in the Chehalis. But in the year that I had apple maggots in the Chehalis, I did not have apple maggots in the Cox's orange pippin apple that was right next to the Chehalis. So there seems to be a predilection for the flies to select certain varieties. So if you can identify what apples they don't like, that can be a factor in your favor in eliminating the flies from your orchard. From what I've read, late ripening varieties seem to be more resistant to the maggot. It might be if there's something in the earlier maturing fruit that it might put up some kind of a chemical scent or something that is more attractive to the apples. Maybe the late ripening varieties don't put that scent out as quickly, so they are later in the season when the flies are less prevalent in the orchard. So I have a very late maturing apple in my yard called a wine crisp. And it doesn't really ripen up at all until November. So I'm going to experiment this year by not treating that tree the way I do the others. And I want to see whether or not any apple maggots find that late maturing apple. This is an experiment. So I'll let you know what happens on that. And lastly, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, apple maggots are regional. And there are certain places, most all places in Western Washington are prone to apple maggots. Eastern Washington is mostly apple maggot free, but there are some areas that do have apple maggots even in Eastern Washington. But it's such a serious problem that the state passed laws that prevent or are intended to prevent people from transporting their homegrown fruit. Orchard-grown fruit is going to be apple maggot free. Homegrown fruit, not so much. So this particular sign is down on Route 522, just as you leave Snohomish County and go into King County. There is a penalty. And I looked that up. I forget exactly what the penalty was, but if you go and look on Revised Code of Washington 17.24, you will be able to look up the penalties that they could get you for. I believe it's $2,500 fine for transporting fruit into areas that you shouldn't. But I don't know of anybody who has actually been convicted of that crime. But hopefully it will deter people from taking their homegrown fruit to other portions of the country. So that will be the end of my presentation. And if there are any questions, please use the chat pass those questions on to Rebecca, and then she will relate them to me, and I will attempt to answer them the best I can.